Starting as the first Robin in 1940, moving on to leading his own team in 1964, graduating from being Robin, becoming his own hero in 1984, and getting his very own solo series in 1995, Richard Grayson has had quite the history in the DC universe, and he's only getting bigger. Nightwing is currently one of the best-selling DC books being published right now, and it's for a good reason. He's not just beloved in the real world, but he is also known as the second most trusted hero in the DC universe, behind none other than Superman, according to Hawkman in Brave and the Bold issue 15. Speaking of Superman, Nightwing is even best friends with both Clark and John, getting his name from either a Kryptonian superhero named Nightwing or a Kryptonian god named Nightwing. He is also my favorite superhero. Growing up, I was a huge Batman fan and loved watching Batman the animated series. Eventually, my favorite gradually became Robin, and as I grew up, I also saw Robin grow into Nightwing. I remember my very first ever Nightwing book was actually the original Nightwing series. Since then, he's been firmly cemented as my favorite character, with me collecting all sorts of Nightwing stuff in the form of books, figures, and even my mouse pad that I use daily. With the exposition out of the way, now let's talk about the main subject of this video. Nightwing, the New Order. And I'm just gonna address this right off the bat. Yes, the name is most likely a reference to the World War II ideology of the same name, but I will not be discussing that because I don't feel it's my place, and I also personally am not well educated enough on the history of it. I welcome anyone to research it if they wish, but it is a disturbing subject, so fair warning to those that will. Also, side note, but the metaphor isn't the greatest considering the book's main character is Romani. This was a retcon that I may not be a fan of, and I know many others may not be a fan of, but just because I don't like it doesn't mean it can be ignored, like I've seen some people do. But with all the serious stuff out of the way, let's get into the book. Nightwing, the New Order is a 6-issue book published by DC Comics, written by Kyle Higgins with art done by Trevor McCarthy and Dean White, spanning from late 2017 to early 2018. Kyle Higgins is actually one of my favorite writers. He's written many of my favorite books, like the latest Darkhawk series, Radiant Black, and even one of my favorite Nightwing books, the New 52 Nightwing series. So going into this book, I knew there were some issues and it wasn't well received in my circle of friends. However, I still wanted to give it a chance due to Kyle Higgins, and honestly, I feel incredibly mixed about this book. To start, it is a bad Nightwing story, with weird character choices and odd consequences. However, it is not a bad story. It's not a great story either, but it's for sure not the worst thing I've ever read. Take this with a grain of salt though, because it is very easy for me to like things, and the only comic I've ever truly disliked is The Boys. Speaking of the story, here's how this video is going to go. After I'm done with this paragraph, I will be giving a spoiler-free breakdown of the story, and then a spoiler breakdown as final thoughts at the end. And between each issue, I'll also be getting just a little bit of my thoughts between them, so that way I can just kind of break them apart and have it more easily digestible. Know that this video or any other video I make is not a substitute for reading the comic, and if you have the means, it is always best to support the industry, especially the creators that make the books, which in turn make my videos possible. So with this disclaimer and video structure out of the way, it's time for the spoiler-free breakdown. For the spoiler-free, I will be covering issues 1 to 3 and avoiding any major spoilers for the overall story. In this alternate universe, powers were only getting increasingly easier to get, leading to more power-related crimes. This broke out into protest and then an eventual war between powered individuals in the city of Metropolis. The war would last 3 days until the 4th day, where Nightwing used a device designed by Darkseid to wipe out 99% of all powers from the Earth. From there, Nightwing and Batwoman began working with the government to pass anti-power laws and eventually banning all powers entirely. If you had powers, you had to take medication to suppress them, but for a very small percentage of powered people, they were immune to the medication, leading to them being frozen by Mr. Freeze in stasis until they could find a way to suppress the powers. The organizations that would enforce these laws were known as the Crusaders, with Nightwing being the face of the entire movement. The Crusaders were essentially an extension of the police, with Richard leading it. Kate Kane is also a leader of it, but it appears that she handles more high-level threats due to her having her very own superpowered task force, aka the Justice League, consisting of many former heroes and villains. It is important to note that the only loophole to not have to suppress your powers is to be a part of this task force, or it's the only loophole in the USA because it's later stated that other countries have less strict anti-power laws. The story then finally starts in the year 2040 and features Richard chasing down the the former villain Dr. Light, who was off his medication leading to his arrest. Richard would then go to Crusader headquarters and gave a press conference where he doubles down on being anti-powers. After the interview, he rushes home where he sees his son Jake and his grandfather Alfred Pennyworth cooking a meal. The three have a dinner and we learn Alfred retired and moved to Arizona after the death of Bruce Wayne. After Jake is sent upstairs to do his homework, we also learn that Alfred is very pro-powers, which leads to a debate between him and Richard. Through this debate, we find out that Richard is against the Stasis Project, but makes up excuses for it anyways. The conversation then ends on bad terms, and later that night, Richard and his son Jake have a heart-to-heart about the power policies, where Richard ends up saying a phrase that will be repeated throughout the book. We make the hardest decisions for the people we care about most. The next day, Richard is at work when he suddenly gets a call from the school, and he rushes there immediately, only to learn that his son Jake has powers. That is the end of issue 1, and there's a lot to talk about for that first issue. The most obvious are the political symbolisms represented at the start. The powers are a stand-in for guns, with the anti-power laws being gun control laws. In my opinion, this is a very weird comparison because unlike guns, some people are born with powers or accidentally given powers and can't get rid of them. The only powers I can think of right away that are choices are things like the Green Lantern rings, where the Lanterns choose to have them. But then again, they are regulated by the Guardians of Oa, so it's still not the greatest comparison. I don't think it's a great symbolic way to portray guns and gun control laws either. There's also the treatment of powered people, which seems to be implying they are almost second-class citizens. This might be a better metaphor for bigotry overall because, as I previously touched on, most powered people didn't choose to become powered. I would discuss this more, however, it's not in the book for a lot of moments, so we can't really see the full scope of it, so that's all I'll say for now. Issue 2 starts with more of a backstory on how the world got this way, but then reveals that Jake's mother is none other than Starfire. Starfire also lost her powers during the big event. We then learn about the events specifically involving Nightwing up to the present day, where he marries Starfire, gets outed as Nightwing, has a failed assassination attempt, and him becoming the face of the Crusaders. We then reach the present day where Richard took Jake to Mr. Terrific's lab. Richard and Michael talk, and Richard is dead set on getting Jake on medication and their lives can return to normal. But of course, Michael tells Richard that he is immune to the medication, meaning that Jake will have to go into stasis. Michael says he won't inform the Crusaders, but it's only a matter of time until a power scanner picks up Jake's power. The Graysons then go home and Jake goes to his room while Richard discusses the situation with Alfred. Alfred points out the hypocrisy to Richard, however he's still set in his ways and reasons with Alfred that he can get Jake a spot on Kate's Justice League. Later, when everyone is asleep, the Crusaders bust in the house and Alfred grabs a bat in order to protect Jake. This leads to a conflict between one of the Crusaders' best pointing a gun at Alfred, and Richard trying to defuse the situation. This fails, however, and Alfred gets shot. And the final panel of issue 2 shows Richard being escorted out of his house in handcuffs. So issue 2 was a big issue for the series, and what I deemed to be the real kickoff point. Issue 1 set up the story and the ideas in play with the characters to pay attention to. Issue 2 then continued the setup, showing what Richard had to endure to get to this point, only to show that it might not have been worth it because it can't protect the ones he loves. You start to see the cracks forming in Richard's argument and see his tone shift. You also start to see a theme that was present in issue 1 that I didn't cover, which is the Crusaders being a stand-in for highly militarized police. Police militarization is a big political issue, of course, but once again, I still think it falls short here because these are super powered beings. I also have issues with the way Alfred dies. It's written like it's this unexpected thing, but it's very easy to foresee, especially leading up to it. Like, let's just analyze this page real quick. Here you have a heavily armored Crusader holding a loaded gun with his finger on the trigger. Now, if we move down, we will see a frail old man holding a baseball bat. The old man then shows a threat to hurt the Crusader with the bat, and they're at a fair distance away. I'm not saying that the Crusader should have shot Alfred. He posed no realistic threat to him and was way out of line for doing so. But Alfred, especially with all the stuff he's been through, should have known not to do anything. Alfred not only worked for Batman for however many years in this universe, but also it's safe to assume he was also a member of the British Army and also a secret British agent. So I feel this is a prime example of mischaracterization, which happens plenty of times in this book. Moving on to the final third issue before we get into the deep and heavy spoilers. Issue 3, I feel, is probably the most important issue in my opinion. It's the one where everything starts being put into place and starts making some sense. The start has us being properly introduced to Kate Kane for the first time in this book, who, if you don't know, is Batwoman. She was the one to give the order to arrest the Graysons and is leader of the superpowered task force I keep bringing up. She tells the Crusader that killed Alfred to offer Richard something to get comfortable but do not confront him. So naturally he confronts him, which gives Richard enough time to escape and fight his way through the building, leading to him using the "if I wear a hood, no one will suspect me" disguise, a favorite of the MCU. After this, Richard goes to his brother Tim's house to ask him to hack into the Crusaders' network to find out where Jake is being transferred to. While doing this, Tim reassures Richard that he made the right choice and shouldn't go back on it now. After finding out the location Jake is going to, Richard makes a pit stop at the Batcave, which has now been turned into a tourist trap. Thankfully, they hadn't reached the lower levels and Richard was able to sneak in and equip himself with some gear and Batcycle. We then get some backstory on this version of Kate Kane and her relationship with Richard. We learn that she is very military heavy and decide that she needed to work for justice on the inside and gave up being a hero. Kate was the one that put the Crusaders program together, but Richard was asked to run it, which seemingly made her bitter. We then cut back to Richard, who's stopped by Green Lantern. Richard attacks first, revealing that he grabbed gloves that were able to bypass John's hard light constructs. However, this was not enough, and we get to the patented "oh shit" moment, where Richard wears his Nightwing costume for the first time in decades. The two fight, but overall, Richard was unprepared and gets his ass kicked, but is then saved by none other than both of his exes, his ex-wife and ex-best friend. This issue is probably one of the best in my opinion. I have a few issues with it. One of them is the characterization of Batwoman. I will admit I have not read much of her, but from what I have, this version seems a bit out of line. Of all the Bat family members, I think she probably would be the most likely to create the Crusaders. However, that's one of the biggest problems with this book, is that I don't think a single Bat family character would go these lengths. We are also introduced for Wally for the first time, whose powers are intact, which is cool. I like his suit, but you'll see this later if you choose to continue with the spoiler segment. His face is just not drawn great, which is something I feel is very important for an adult Wally. I do quite like the Green Lantern versus Nightwing fight. It's drawn amazingly and it gets the point across that despite his intelligence and quick thinking, Richard is both too old to continue his old ways and out of practice. Another thing that I like is Nightwing's suit. Instead of going with the Rebirth or New 52 suit, they go with the Classic, which is great. It does get upgraded later on with some bits of armor, which I personally like for this book, but I'm aware that I am in the minority of comic fans that like armored suits. This is now your final warning for spoilers for the final 3 issues. On Amazon, you can get the book for Kindle or Comixology for $9.99, or if you want it physically, it is $14.01. I also urge you to support your local comic and or bookshop if you can. They might have it for cheaper and you can get it right away upon purchase, but since this is a book from a couple of years ago that didn't sell great, they might not have it, so just warning you there. For issue 4, I'm going to tell you the Crusader part of the story first, since it's short and so I can keep the Nightwing parts connected. The book opens with the Crusaders doing some generic science liquid swirls, and it's reinforced that Jake's body is actively fighting against the medicine that inhibits his powers. Kate then talks to him and tries to reassure him that everything will be okay. However, Jake does not believe Kate. Later, the two main Crusaders clash, and then a major breakthrough in Jake's condition comes forth. And then that's it for the Crusaders. That's all of the important things for them. On to Nightwing, where he wakes up in a hospital bed surrounded by his fellow Titans, and also Lois Lane, who's a Blue Lantern now. It's revealed that the Titans have an inside source to the Crusaders and that Jake is not in stasis yet. The team now goes to plan how they break Jake out, and as they walk around, Richard realizes where their base is located. As they start planning, it's revealed that Jake's case is unique, that he's actually the cure to give everyone their powers back. This causes a heated argument between Wally and Richard, leading to Lois using her ring to calm Richard down. Unfortunately, the way the ring chooses to calm him down is publicly showing his deepest desires, which is him being in a happy family with Corey and Jake. Now this is not great for him, since Corey was right there and the construct kissed him. And I'm not really great at this whole relationship thing, but I imagine having your deepest desire be shown to be kissing your ex in front of your ex might be awkward. The two later have a private heart-to-heart talk that essentially ends up with whatever difference we have, let's put them aside to save our son. The team then goes to do exactly that in a seemingly very easy way, but just as they reunite, they're interrupted by Mr. Freeze. I don't have a lot of thoughts on this issue, but one that I mainly want to talk about is just the inclusion of Lois Lane. The Titans in this book are the new Teen Titans roster, like many people know, except instead of Raven, it's Lois Lane. I have no way to confirm this or deny this, but part of me really wants to think that Lois was actually supposed to be Raven. Lois is shown with a hood up every now and then, which is what Raven does, and now has a lantern ring that projects constructs with no explanation given of how she got it. However, I'm also torn because there are very specific Lois Lane and Blue Lantern ring moments later on. I do find the inclusion of Lois odd considering the other team members, but also seeing Lois with a Blue Lantern ring is an incredibly interesting concept that I'm quite fond of. I googled it real quick, and this is the only time she's been shown as a Blue Lantern in her entire comic history, which is interesting because it makes a lot of sense to me personally. If you don't know, Blue Lantern rings are fueled by hope, and Lois Lane is a very hopeful character. So to me, it just makes sense. That was all I really wanted to touch on here. There are some other stuff like the trope of Jake being the cure, and I already touched on the whole Richard's deepest desire thing, so next issue. Issue 5 is the penultimate issue and probably my favorite. It starts with just one page of the Crusaders where it shows Kate has figured out Liz was the mole. But thankfully for Liz, there was an important alert, and we now see what the alert was. Something I didn't mention in the last issue was that Wally was hit with a ton of darts, and in this issue, it's explained that those darts somehow took away Wally's speed. Something previously thought to be impossible. The Titans try to fight their way out, but get cornered between Freeze and a Crusader assault team. Thankfully, Jake powered up and shot his laser hands through the ceiling, but just before they escape, Kate has Jake in the crosshairs of her sniper. But just like the Titans saved Liz earlier, Liz saved the Titans by punching Kate, giving the Titans an opening to escape. When the Titans get back, everyone is celebrating and having fun, while Richard lives up to his abbreviated name and does the cliche, "Well guys, I know we had our fun and this is a real breakthrough and stuff, but I'm taking you in, cause I'm a loser and still, for some reason, have anti-power beliefs. Also, I love my son who has powers." But then Jake comes and goes, "No dad, I've got powers and I will not keep them secret. 'Cause I'm gay, super powered." Then Lois uses her ring and knocks out Richard, making him unconscious. When Richard wakes up, he's in a car on its way to Metropolis. However, as soon as they reach Metropolis, they are ambushed by a local gang. Thankfully, they're so lucky in this issue because they are saved by old Superman. After that, Lois and Clark reunite in the only way a straight couple can in fictional media, and the rest are introduced to Lex Luthor, who has turned over a new leaf and helps the pro-power resistance. Later, Jake goes into the lab and gets tested while talking to Superman, where we find out what made Richard turn sides. Apparently, during the Metropolis War, someone on the other side got their hands on black kryptonite and used it on Superman, forcing him to kill Batman. Meanwhile, Richard is stuck in a holding cell talking to himself. Or is he? So this issue doesn't have much to talk about, but I'll touch up on a few things. Early in the issue, we learn that the Blue Lantern ring doesn't reach its full potential unless it's in the presence of a Green Lantern ring. Very weird thing to say that I'm sure won't come into play in the next issue. Also, my dramatic retelling isn't completely accurate, and of course, very short, since the actual argument spans a total of 3 pages. The actual argument isn't a gay allegory like I made it out to be, but it was the easiest way for me to get the hypocrisy point through in a short time, and also I just found it funny. And the final point I want to make is the page where Superman kills Batman is absolutely gorgeous. This is an amazing full page, and I love the tiny details like seeing the skeleton of Batman glow from the heat vision. It's just incredibly good, and props to Trevor McCarthy and Dean White. I really like this image, and I kind of want a poster of it. Now, the final issue and the final warning. If everything up to this point intrigues you and you really want to read it, the link to DC's page for this book is in the description. Now let's get to the book. We start with Jake watching holotapes of his dad as Robin, but when his mother comes into his room to rekindle their relationship, Jake shows no signs of willingness to do so and goes to bed. We then take a quick page break to show Lex has figured out a way to reconnect Wally to the Speed Force, and then back to Jake, where his father is standing in front of his bed asking for Jake to trust him. Together they sneak out and it's shown that Richard called Kate, snitching on the others in order for Jake and him to have safe passage out of the country. Kate, of course, showed up with a small army of Crusaders. But we also have the first look at our Justice League, which is very interesting to me. The roster is Green Lantern, Captain Atom, Red Tornado, Azrael, and a female Captain Cold. I couldn't find an example of another female Captain Cold in the comics, and what's weird to me, in my opinion, is that Captain Cold does not have powers. He did for a while, but he has technology. He's got a cold gun. So it's a very strange inclusion to me, but anyways. Jake protests to this, and Richard does what any loving father would do and knock his son the fuck out. He then kidnaps him and puts him in a car as they drive away. The Crusaders start their attack shortly after the two leave, starting with Lois and Corey first. John Stewart was the one leading this attack, but as it just so happens, John is in fact a Green Lantern. And as we so coincidentally established before, Blue Lantern rings reach their full potential, and Lois taps into blowing a hole in the side of the building with her ring. This alerts the others, and Lex deploys his squadron of Lexbots. This starts a whole war between the rebels and the Crusaders. During this, Jake wakes up and talks some sense to his dad by comparing Richard to Batman and Jake to Robin, which of course works and gets the two to return to the fight, where Wally instantly takes Jake to Lex. Jake then gets hooked up to a machine, and the machine turns on. After some screaming, Superman's powers return to him. Due to this, Lex then turns on them, revealing that he also charged a bomb that will give everyone in the world powers to even the playing field, but it will take out Metropolis in the process. Superman and Jake rush outside and inform everyone of the situation, causing the team to work together. They lift up the bomb and subsequently an entire city block. The block then blows up, and Jake has a fake out death but returns and everyone is happy. After this, we get a flash forward of a timeline of events. 5 years after this, powers were deemed legal again. Kate resigned from her position, the Crusaders were still power police, but it was ran by Liz, and then Richard and Corey didn't get back together but still stayed friends. Eventually, Richard hired Jake to work at his new school meant to teach kids how to control their powers. We then see Jake all grown up, and it's revealed the entire book was a retelling by Jake firsthand for a recording for his son named Richard. That was Nightwing: The New Order. In my opinion, this book wasn't as bad as I've heard, but was not great. I think one of the things that made this book bad from my perspective was the use of DC characters. Because it used already established characters, it had poor representation of certain characters and made the book suffer because we know these characters and know they'd probably not act like this in this situation. It would work better if it was a completely new superhero universe for this book, but that also comes with the challenges of building up the characters before this, showing the world before powers became illegal, and overall a lot more work making a mini-series probably double in length. I will say this book does have some great ideas though. Lois as a Blue Lantern is my favorite thing from this book. It felt natural and I'd like to see something like it happen in the main continuity for an arc or two. I also thought the idea of Beast Boy losing his powers mid-morph was clever. It provided some good moments and keeps the beast part of him even without his powers. And the final thing that I will note about this series is that I really enjoyed these covers. The idea of framing each cover as a sort of propaganda poster or political poster in general was a very clever idea and got me some great thumbnail material. Thank you all for watching, and I'll hopefully see you all not in half a year. I'm very bad at managing my time, but hopefully you guys like this video and can consider subscribing, liking, leaving a comment, and something else, I don't know.